The kingdom of Judah continued for a while. They too had come under pressure from the Assyrian Empire, but managed to maintain their independence. Eventually, the Assyrian Empire succumbed and more or less fell into the lap of a rising power in the ancient Near East, centered in the city of Babylon. And so we refer to what came next as the Babylonian Empire, really without having necessarily to fight a battle. They took over the Assyrian Empire, and now that pressure on the little kingdom of Judah was coming from mighty Babylon. And so we hear about Babylon, we hear about Assyria too, but we hear about Babylon a great deal in the writings of the prophets. Eventually, and it's during the lifetime of the prophet Jeremiah, eventually Babylon invades the kingdom of Judah. They besiege the city of Jerusalem, they destroy it, and in particular, they level and destroy Solomon's temple, carrying away to Babylon all of the gold, all of the expensive vessels of that great structure. And they also put out the eyes of the last king of Judah. They made him watch as they killed his sons. That's the last thing he got to see with his eyes. Then they put out his eyes and led him in chains to Babylon. They also took away, again, all of the best and leading people, leaving behind only the poorest of the poor, people who are called in Hebrew the Am Haaretz, the people of the land. But what happened with these descendants of Judah when they got taken away into Babylon was different than what happened to the people from the northern kingdom, Israel. Babylon did not disperse them throughout the empire, and the people of Judah maintained their identity there in exile. They held on to their literature. They held on to these books that were beginning to be called Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. They held on to the writings of the prophets. They held on to other writings as well, like Psalms and Ecclesiastes. And indeed, some writings continued to be produced even in exile. And in that place, in exile, some new institutions began to take shape. The Judahites could not carry on their worship anymore because they had no temple. But there came into being in Babylon an institution they came to call the synagogue, the gathering place. And in the synagogue, they would read their ancient literature, study, discuss, and they began to practice prayer at the times when sacrifice used to be offered in the temple. So in place of sacrifice, they now did prayer, and there began to be a new kind of leader among these Judahites, a new kind of leader who came to be called a rabbi. And the rabbis were particularly known for their expertise in Israel's traditional writings. The rabbis were experts in the traditions of ancient Israel, and their job was to teach the ways of the Lord, to help people learn and know how to pray and to lead them in prayer. And so Judah's life went on in exile, and as an aside, you can read one of the Psalms of exile, which begins, "By the waters of Babylon, we hung up our harps. And when the people said, 'Sing us one of the Lord's songs,' we said, 'How can we sing the Lord's songs in this alien land?'" You can find those lines in the book of Psalms in the Bible. Thank you for joining me today.